The morning began with the simplest sound, shoes brushing against dusty ground, as hundreds of ordinary men and women gathered outside an old industrial gate in Comsilga. Some of them once worked here nearly 2 decades ago before the machines went silent and the factory was left to die. Others were children back then, watching their parents carry home the sadness of losing steady work. Today they stood shoulder to shoulder holding their breath in a way only people who have seen both hope and disappointment can understand. There were no fireworks, no grand orchestra, just a battered loudspeaker crackling to life announcing that the president of Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, had arrived. And suddenly the air changed. You could feel something rising, not noise, not hysteria, but dignity. The kind of dignity a community regains when something stolen is finally brought back home. Because this wasn't just an inauguration, it was a resurrection. For 17 long years, the Brafasso brewery was spoken of like a ghost, shut down, bought out, sabotaged, buried under the weight of corruption and foreign pressure. Yet the people never forgot it. They never forgot what it meant to earn a living on their own soil. They never forgot what it felt like to produce, to build, to stand tall. And today, as the crowd watched the military convoy approach, a single question hung in the morning air, one that echoes far beyond Africa. When was the last time you saw a nation fight to reclaim its own industry, with nothing but its people and its courage? And perhaps a more uncomfortable question for us, watching from afar. If a small nation like Burkina Faso can resurrect what was once destroyed, what does that say about the power of true leadership and the power of national sovereignty? So stay with us, because what happened in Comsilga is bigger than a factory reopening. It's a reminder of why leadership matters, why courage still matters. And if you believe that truth and determination deserve to be seen, not hidden behind headlines, make sure to subscribe. You might just be among the first to understand what President Ibrahim Traoré is truly building, not only for Burkina Faso, but for the future of Africa. The ceremony in Comsilga began in a way that felt almost old-fashioned, like something Americans might remember from the days when local factories were the pride of entire towns. Officials stepped forward one by one, offering formal greetings, acknowledging dignitaries, and honoring traditions that still matter deeply across Africa. There was respect, order, and decorum, but just beneath it, there was anticipation. Everyone knew why they were truly gathered. Something long dead was about to breathe again. The president of the local delegation was the first to speak on behalf of the people of Comsilga. His voice carried both humility and pride as he welcomed President Ibrahim Traoré and the government officials who accompanied him. He reminded the audience, and perhaps reminded himself, that this land once held an industrial jewel, a place that brought jobs, dignity, and stability, a place that before collapsing had fed families and anchored an entire community. He spoke for every parent who remembered the day the factory shut its doors in 2008. He spoke for every young worker who had to leave home in search of income. He spoke for the local farmers, drivers, vendors, whose small livelihoods had once depended on a functioning industrial ecosystem. And he expressed a simple truth. Our community never stopped hoping that one day Brafasso would rise again. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for, the official address by the Minister of Industry, Commerce and Handicrafts. His speech was not cold policy talk. It was deeply emotional, almost revolutionary in tone, because this factory was no ordinary project. According to him, it was a symbol of something bigger, a nation reclaiming control over what once was lost. He explained the long and painful history, how the original brewery had been created by a private promoter in 2024 but quickly collapsed under pressure, how foreign interests and multinational companies threatened by a rising local competitor maneuvered to suffocate it, how the government had purchased the facility in 2012 for more than 40 billion CFA francs, yet even then the machines were never allowed to restart. How the infrastructure stood like a corpse for 17 years gathering dust while Burkina Faso continued importing beverages at high cost. For older American viewers, this might feel familiar, the slow death of local industries under the weight of global powers' monopolies and foreign agendas. The minister reminded the audience that everything changed in 2024 when President Ibrahim Traoré issued a simple but powerful order: bring Brafasso back to life and do it quickly. His words were described as a turning point: rendre possible ce qui paraissait impossible. Make possible what others insisted could never happen. From that day forward, the rhythm of the country changed. Workers in Burkina Faso and engineers in China labored around the clock. Contracts were signed, equipment arrived, walls were rebuilt, machines were revived. It was not easy, and the minister did not hide the fact that the project faced reactionary interests that wanted to see it fail. But the government pushed forward anyway. Then came the numbers that matter, because they reflect sacrifice. 9 billion CFA francs invested in new equipment. 9 billion in infrastructure rehabilitation, nearly 18 billion CFA in total, funded entirely by Burkina Faso's own resources, no foreign loans, no IMF conditions, no multinational controlling stake, and finally, he revealed the scale of what was now ready to operate, a fully restored brewery with a capacity of over 600,000 hectoliters per year, producing 2 flagship beverages, Brasfort and Brasso, with more products on the way including sugar drinks and mineral water. The minister described it as a national pride, a symbol of sovereignty and the people's brewery. By the time he finished the ceremony, no longer felt like a protocol event. It felt like a turning point, the moment a nation decided to stop waiting for others to save it and instead began saving itself. When the minister concluded his address, the atmosphere in Comsilga shifted. His speech had stirred pride certainly, but what came next pushed the entire ceremony into another emotional dimension. It was the moment that turned an industrial inauguration into something closer to a national awakening. From the side of the stage stepped a man known across Burkina Faso, a slammer, a poet, a voice often described as the echo of the voiceless. His name was HDV, and the crowd instantly recognized him. Many older citizens whispered among themselves. They knew that when he spoke, he did not simply perform. He summoned memory, he summoned pain, and he summoned hope. He approached the microphone slowly, head slightly bowed as if carrying the weight of something sacred. When he began, his voice was low, almost mournful. Il est mort. C'est fini. He is dead. It is over. The crowd fell silent. He described Brafasso not as a building, not as a business, but as a man, a symbol murdered by forces stronger than him. He spoke of how our enemies had condemned him, tortured him, humiliated him before killing him and burying him with all his dreams. The metaphors were raw, almost biblical in tone. Older Americans might recall the way artists once narrated the death of American factories, but this was different. This was a story of resurrection. The slammer continued, his voice rising. They killed him because he dared to dream of sovereignty. Each word seemed to hit the crowd like a wave. You could see elders nodding slowly, their faces marked by years of struggle. Younger people tightened their jaws, absorbing a narrative they had inherited rather than lived. HDV wasn't simply reciting poetry, he was stitching together the collective wound of a nation betrayed by global economic powers. Then, just when the emotion felt overwhelming, he pivoted. His voice sharpened, filled with defiance. Mais ça c'est mal connaître le Burkinabè. But that is to misunderstand the Burkinabè. He declared that one man had arrived and changed everything, a clear reference to President Ibrahim Traoré. He described the president not as a savior, but as a catalyst who reminded the nation that what appears dead can rise again. And in that moment, the symbolic corpse of Brafasso began to breathe. What happened next was the true climax of the ceremony. HDV raised his hand toward the factory newly painted and humming behind the stage and proclaimed, "Brafasso que je vois là, il dort. Nous allons lui donner une seconde vie. Brafasso, as I see it, is only sleeping. We will give it a second life." The crowd erupted applause mixed with shouts, the kind that come from people who have waited too long to believe in something real. Some cried openly, others held their children up so they could see the moment. The sound was not celebration alone, it was vindication. Then came the line that defined the day: "S'ils veulent encore le tuer, il faudra d'abord passer sur le corps du peuple." If they want to kill it again, they will have to walk over the bodies of the people. This was not political rhetoric. It was a declaration of ownership, not by the government, not by investors, but by the people themselves. And it was a direct message to the foreign multinationals and geopolitical actors who once strangled the factory into collapse: Burkina Faso will not surrender twice. The slammer then turned his attention toward the imperialists and their local servants, condemning their fear of a people who have stopped begging and started building. He mocked those who once celebrated giving Burkina Faso donations of a truck or a tank while simultaneously crushing its industries. His message was clear: if rebuilding industry is propaganda, then let this propaganda continue because it creates jobs, hope, and dignity. Every verse struck with precision. This factory was built with 100% national funds. This industry will no longer export raw wealth at dawn and re-import poverty at dusk. This Brafasso belongs to the people and therefore cannot die as long as the people live. By the time he concluded, the air in Comsilga felt electric. The audience wasn't just reacting to art, they were responding to a redefinition of their identity. They were no longer spectators, they were participants in a collective resurrection. The poet stepped back. The crowd roared. And for the first time in 17 years, the old factory behind them no longer looked like a ruin. It looked alive. As the echoes of the slammer's final words faded, something deeper began to settle over Comsilga, a realization that this resurrection was not symbolic alone. It carried real consequences that would touch the daily lives of ordinary people, ripple through the political landscape, and redefine what national sovereignty means in the 21st century. For families who once depended on the factory, the reopening meant something simple yet profound: stability. Many in the crowd had lived through the years when young men left their hometowns for mining sites, dangerous road work, or migration routes that took them thousands of miles from home. With SN Brafasso back in operation, these families could imagine a future where their sons and daughters could work in their own community, earning honorable wages without risking their lives abroad. Local farmers, especially maize, sorghum, and sugar producers, felt a surge of hope as well. The factory's revival meant consistent demand for raw materials sourced locally. It meant shorter supply chains, better purchasing prices, and a break from the old cycle where foreign companies dictated terms that left farmers underpaid and powerless. For rural households already strained by insecurity and climate stress, this shift could mean surviving the next decade with dignity. And then there was the political dimension, perhaps the most significant and the most sensitive. SN Brafasso was not just an industrial asset. It was, in the words of both the minister and the poet, a battlefield victory, not against a neighboring state, but against a global economic system that had long kept nations like Burkina Faso dependent, indebted, and unable to choose their own path. The factory's revival became a living example of the ideology President Ibrahim Traoré has championed: build with national funds, produce locally, transform raw materials before exporting, refuse unnecessary foreign loans, break monopolies that suffocate domestic industry, restore pride through self-reliance. For a country like Burkina Faso, landlocked, historically impoverished, and structurally dependent, this approach is revolutionary. And revolutions always carry political consequences. Domestically, the successful reopening strengthened the legitimacy of the transitional government. Even citizens who were skeptical of the young captain found themselves acknowledging that few leaders in modern African history had revived a dead factory in less than 2 years without foreign lending and in the midst of security challenges. The project demonstrated capacity, a trait older Burkinabè voters valued deeply. Regionally, the message was unmistakable. In a Sahel torn by coups, terrorism, and geopolitical competition, Burkina Faso was signaling a new development model: sovereignty first, partnerships second. Neighboring countries watched closely, especially Mali and Niger, both part of the AES alliance, as the factory became physical proof that post-colonial dependency was not destiny. Internationally, however, the implications were more complicated. The ceremony, especially the slammer's defiant speech, made clear that Burkina Faso no longer intended to walk softly in global affairs. Critics abroad would likely interpret the rhetoric as provocative, even hostile. But for the people on the ground, this was not aggression, it was liberation. And finally, on the social level, something even more powerful emerged: a restored sense of collective ownership. When the poet declared that Brafasso was the beer of the people, he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He meant that the brewery, its profits, its jobs, its identity, belonged to those who had suffered its loss. This sense of ownership ignited community pride, especially among youth who for years felt excluded from their country's economic story. By the end of the day, as workers toured the revived factory, one truth became unmistakable: Burkina Faso had not just rebuilt a business, it had rebuilt belief. Belief that a nation can rise without permission. Belief that sovereignty is not abstract. Belief that progress is possible even after years of decline. And belief, above all, that when a people stand together, their future cannot be buried. For many Americans over 60, watching events like the resurrection of SN Brafasso may stir memories of a very different era: the post-war decades when American towns were anchored by steel mills, car plants, textile factories, and rail hubs. In those days, a factory wasn't just a building, it was a heartbeat. It shaped the identity of a community, defined its rhythms, and held families together generation after generation. So when Americans of that generation look at Comsilga's transformation, the comparison is almost unavoidable. What Burkina Faso is fighting to reclaim today, industrial dignity, is something America once possessed in abundance and in many places has lost. The reopening of Brafasso mirrors the way older Americans remember the closure of their own factories, first neglected, then abandoned, then destroyed by forces bigger than the workers who depended on them. But here is the difference. Burkina Faso is not just mourning an industrial past, it is actively rebuilding one. And that fact alone places this small West African nation in direct tension with global economic structures that have long favored dependence over autonomy. From a U.S. foreign policy perspective, what happened in Comsilga raises challenging questions. For decades, Washington has positioned itself as a champion of free markets and global integration. Yet many Americans now wonder whether those same systems contributed to the disappearance of their own local industries, offshoring jobs, and weakening the economic core of small towns. In that sense, Burkina Faso's project forces the question, should the United States respect or fear a nation that chooses to rebuild its own industries without relying on foreign lenders or multinational corporations? Older Americans, especially those who lived through the decline of Rust Belt cities, may sympathize with the determination of a country trying to avoid a similar fate. They know what it means to lose control over production, to watch foreign corporations dictate terms, and to feel powerless as national pride erodes alongside industrial capacity. From the broader Western perspective, however, SN Brafasso represents something unsettling: a nation rejecting external economic authority, a leader prioritizing sovereignty over foreign approval, a government rebuilding industry without IMF loans, a population rallying behind self-reliance. These trends challenge long-established global hierarchies. And while the transcript does not name the United States directly, the references to multinationals, imperialists, and reactionary interests indicate a perception that Western powers have historically played a role in suppressing local industries. Meanwhile, in Africa, the symbolism is even stronger. Across the continent, from Mali to Niger to Ghana, leaders, students, soldiers, and workers are watching closely. If Burkina Faso succeeds with its fully domestically funded industrial revival, others may follow. This could accelerate a wider shift in Africa away from reliance on the West and towards South-South partnerships, localized production, and resource sovereignty. China and Russia, for their part, will interpret this development differently. They see opportunity: a rising African bloc seeking partners who do not impose political conditions. Western nations, in contrast, may view it as a strategic loss, a sign that African countries are drifting away from long-standing spheres of influence. Yet, for the American viewer, one question rises above geopolitics. Isn't it admirable, even inspiring, to see a people rebuild what was once taken from them using nothing but their hands, their resources, and their determination? What happened in Comsilga is not merely a political statement. It is a reminder of something many Americans once believed deeply: that a nation's strength begins with what it can build for itself. As the sun dipped lower over Comsilga, the celebrations slowly gave way to reflection. The crowds began to disperse, but the feeling in the air lingered: a mix of pride, relief, and something even stronger: conviction. SN Brafasso was alive again, but the spirit behind its resurrection reached far beyond the brewery walls. What happened here was not just a local triumph. It was a warning to the world and a reminder to every nation, small or large, that sovereignty is never given freely. It must be protected, nurtured, and sometimes resurrected from the dust. For Burkina Faso, the reopening of Brafasso is a declaration of intent. It signals that this country is no longer willing to allow foreign interests to determine its economic destiny. It suggests that the people have finally decided to reclaim what was once taken, not with weapons, but with work, not with rhetoric, but with production, not with dependency, but with dignity. But with this new direction comes real risks. The same global powers that once worked to suffocate local industries will not simply step aside. Supply chains, trade agreements, and industrial markets are rarely neutral. They are arenas of power. History has shown in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and even in America's own Rust Belt that when local industries threaten global monopolies, resistance follows. Sometimes quietly, sometimes aggressively. That is why what happened in Comsilga must be understood not only as a celebration, but as the opening chapter of a longer struggle. And this leads us to questions that matter deeply, especially for viewers who have lived long enough to recognize the signs of historical change. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's push for economic sovereignty can truly withstand international pressure? Do you think Burkina Faso is ready for the challenges that come with rebuilding an industrial base on its own terms? And if this movement succeeds, what will it mean for the future of Africa and for the balance of power in the world? These are not distant questions. They echo through every factory town, every rural community, every nation searching for a path away from dependency. In many ways, the struggle of Burkina Faso mirrors the struggle many Americans once faced to rebuild what was lost and to take pride again in what they could produce. So if you've followed this story to the end, let your voice be part of the conversation. Please share this video if you believe you are among the first to witness and support a new model of leadership in Africa, one grounded in sovereignty, responsibility, and courage. Subscribe if you believe the truth deserves to be heard and that stories like this matter more than the headlines. And as always, we invite you to reflect, question, and engage, because the future being shaped in places like Comsilga may soon redefine what we think is possible, not only for Burkina Faso, but for all nations seeking their own independent path.